In the quiet and flickering candlelight of the medieval courts, where the scent of burning wax mixed with the musk of velvet and gold, power was not only measured in armies or lands, it was measured in desire. Among the grand monarchs and crowned lords of Europe, there were some whose passions knew no limits. Behind stone walls and guarded doors, kings who ruled nations could not rule themselves. One such ruler, whose name echoed in whispers through ancient corridors, was King Philip IV of France, known in history as Philip the Fair. But fairness did not touch his heart. He was tall, handsome, and cold, his blue eyes like winter ice. People worshipped his beauty, but few knew the darkness of obsession that grew beneath that polished crown. The court described him as pious, but at night, the same man who knelt before the altar indulged in the pleasures of sin. It is said that in his private chambers, tapestries depicting holy battles hung side by side with paintings of forbidden acts, art too obscene for any other noble eyes. Philip's rule stretched across the 13th and 14th centuries, an age when the church's authority reached into every bedroom. Yet he dared to challenge both morality and God. His fascination with beauty turned cruel. He gathered women from across his kingdom, not just nobles, but the wives of knights, the daughters of merchants, even the wives of his own servants. These women were brought under the guise of serving the queen, but within the marble halls, their service belonged to the king, the queen. Joan of Navarre lived in silent humiliation, her eyes dulled from years of betrayal. Yet she remained, for divorce was a sin, and royal women had no escape. Every evening, the king's chambers were lit with soft light from golden candelabras. Musicians played quietly in distant rooms, while guards stood motionless outside, pretending not to hear the laughter or the sobs that drifted through the thick wooden doors. Philip's obsession was not only with pleasure, but with control. He viewed the women of his court not as people, but as tokens of his power, symbols of his divine right to possess whatever he desired. His lust became a political tool, a way to humiliate his rivals. The wives of disobedient knights mysteriously received the king's attention. Those who refused him found their husbands stripped of lands, imprisoned, or worse. Whispers spread through Paris that the king was cursed. Priests muttered that his soul had been tainted by lust, and some even claimed that his misdeeds provoked the wrath of heaven itself. And perhaps they were right, for soon strange misfortunes began to haunt his family. His 3 sons, Louis, Philip, and Charles, each married noble women of great beauty. But one by one, those queens became embroiled in a scandal so vile it shook France to its core, infamous Tour de Nesle affair. The story goes that the king's daughters-in-law began to mirror his own moral decay, engaging in secret affairs with handsome young knights. When word reached Philip, he erupted in rage, not because of their sins, but because of their defiance. He ordered their lovers executed, their bodies mutilated, and the women imprisoned for life. His lust for power turned against his own bloodline. The people began to fear him. His once beautiful face grew pale and hollow, as though drained by his own corruption. Priests refused to bless his meals. His confessions grew longer, but his sins never fewer. And then, one bitter winter night, Philip fell ill. The legend says that as he lay dying, he saw the ghosts of all the women he had wronged standing round his bed. their eyes cold and unforgiving. He tried to speak, but his tongue was dry as dust. The candles in his room flickered and died, and the king who once possessed everything died, surrounded by sun-loved, unshriven, and damned. But his legacy of lust did not die with him. Across medieval Europe, other monarchs followed his pathmen, who believed that the crown gave them the right to take, touch, and destroy. The line between ruler and sinner blurred, and the throne itself became a symbol of temptation. In castles from France to England, behind velvet curtains and iron doors, the same story repeated: a king too powerful for his own soul, and too weak to resist his desires. In those days, the church often turned a blind eye. A king's sin was not a matter of confession, it was a matter of state. If the ruler funded the building of cathedrals, if he knelt before the Pope and kissed his ring, his sins could be forgiven or at least forgotten. And so, the cycle of indulgence continued, century after century, hidden behind the golden symbols of divine right to the common people. The king was chosen by God, yet behind his sacred image lay the heart of a man undone by his flesh. Servants who worked in royal chambers would sometimes whisper about strange rituals, kings who bathed in milk to preserve their youth, queens who used rare perfumes made from exotic animal oils, and royal physicians who were ordered to brew potions that could reignite desire long after nature had fated it. Power made them insatiable. They had conquered nations and riches. Now they sought to conquer the limits of the body. At night, when the castle halls grew silent and the torches dimmed, servants heard doors creak open and footsteps echo through the corridors. Sometimes they saw the silhouette of their king wandering alone, half-dressed, as if haunted by something unseen. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps it was hunger. Medieval records describe kings who confessed to priests that they could no longer feel satisfaction, no matter how much they took. Their sins had devoured their pleasure. The priests offered them fasting and prayer, but such men could not survive without indulgence. Philip's story became a warning, whispered through generations, that power without restraint breeds madness, and lust without love leads only to emptiness. Centuries later, chroniclers would still recall the fair king who was ugly within, and though his castles crumbled and his bloodline ended in misfortune, his ghost lingered in history, a reminder that even kings could drown in their own desires. In the stillness of the medieval night, when the wind howled across empty battlements, servants said they could still hear the sound of footsteps pacing in an endless circle, trapped forever in the shadows of his own sin. There are kings who ruled with wisdom, kings who ruled with cruelty, and then there are kings who ruled with madness disguised as passion. In the dim corridors of English history, one figure stands out like a flame in the fog: King Henry VIII. His story is not only one of power and politics, but of obsession, betrayal, and the endless hunger for both love and dominance. When people speak of Henry, they remember the 6 wives, the executions, the creation of the Church of England. But hidden behind the portraits of his broad shoulders and jeweled hat lies a truth much darker than mere ambition. Henry was a man enslaved not by his enemies, but by his own desires. He began as a golden prince, the embodiment of the Renaissance dream. Tall, athletic, charming, and educated, he dazzled Europe with his wit and beauty. Courtiers described him as the perfect man, both scholar and warrior. Yet beneath the polished image, there burned an untamed fire. From his youth, Henry believed that pleasure was not a sin. For a king it was a privilege. His court became a theater of excess. Banquets stretched late into the night, filled with roasted meats, spiced wines, and laughter that echoed through marble halls. Minstrels sang of chivalry, but in the shadows, behind the curtains, the king's courtiers whispered of the other entertainments that followed the feast's secret games, forbidden dances, and private company chosen by the king himself. But for all his indulgence, Henry was haunted by one thing: the need for a male heir. This obsession twisted his heart into something monstrous when his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, failed to give him a surviving son. His affection turned to resentment. He convinced himself that God had cursed their union because she had once been his brother's wife. Yet deep down, it wasn't only divine punishment that he feared, it was impotence. The terror that he, the mighty king, could not create what he most desired. His lust and his insecurity fed one another, growing into an endless cycle. Then came Anne Boleyn, the woman who would ignite both his greatest passion and his greatest sin. Unlike the docile ladies of court, she refused his advances for years, forcing the king to pursue her like a man possessed. Letters written by Henry reveal his obsession. He called her his mistress of heart, his only desire, his sweet enemy. He built her castles, showered her with jewels, and promised to make her queen. But his passion for Anne was not love, it was addiction. The more she resisted, the deeper he sank into madness. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine, Henry's lust drove him to defy Rome itself. He tore his kingdom away from the Catholic Church, executed those who opposed him, and crowned himself the supreme head of a new faithful to possess one woman. The irony was cruel. Once he had her, his obsession began to fade. Anne's beauty, once intoxicating, became ordinary to him. Her sharp wit began to irritate him. The fire that had once burned in his eyes turned cold. When she failed to bear him a son, he saw her not as his queen, but as a curse. The end came swiftly and mercilessly. Accused of adultery, witchcraft, and incest, Anne was imprisoned in the Tower of London. On a spring morning in 1536, she was led to the scaffold, her black eyes calm and defiant. The king watched from his palace, dressed in silks, his expression unreadable. When the sword fell, he smiled faintly, as if a burden had been lifted. The same night, he feasted, as if celebrating victory. His lust had devoured yet another life, and he felt no guilt. For Henry, women were chapters in his story of power, written, read, and discarded. But lust cannot be satisfied by conquest alone. As the years passed, the once handsome king became bloated and diseased. His legs swelled with ulcers. His breath reeked of decay. He surrounded himself with younger women, but none could fill the void left by his obsession with himself. The man who once danced and sang now limped through his palace, haunted by ghosts of the wives he had destroyed. Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine. Catherine, the names blurred together like verses of a dark prayer at night. Servants said they could hear him screaming in his sleep, calling out for his lost queens. His chambers smelled of medicine and blood. Even in agony, he demanded that musicians play love songs, their soft melodies echoing through the cold rooms. Perhaps he wanted to believe he could still feel desire. But his pleasures had turned to pain, his appetites to torment. By the time he died in 1547, few mourned him. The people of England had long stopped seeing him as their golden prince. They saw only a tyrant who had burned through wives, friends, and faith alike. And yet, history remembers Henry not just for his cruelty, but for the strange way his lust reshaped the world. His desire for one woman changed religion forever, splitting Christendom in two. His personal obsession birthed a national revolution. Few kings have ever been so completely undone by their passions, and yet so successful in binding their sins into the fabric of history. But beneath the grand narrative, the truth remains simple and tragic. Henry VIII was a man who could not bear the silence of his own emptiness. His heart, once filled with music and laughter, became a hollow drum, beating only for the echo of desire. And so, his story endures, not as a tale of power, but as a warning of what happens when love becomes possession and passion turns into a weapon in the quiet corridors of Hampton Court. Some say his spirit still roams, limping through the moonlit halls where he once danced. Guards have reported hearing the faint sound of a heavy man's footsteps, followed by a soft sigh, as though the old king still searches for something he never found in life. In the dim glow of medieval torches, where every whisper could be treason and every desire could be death, there lived a king whose passion defied not only his people's laws, but the laws of God himself. His name was King Alfonso IX of Leon, a ruler remembered less for his battles and more for the scandal that turned his court into legend. History often hides such stories behind polite phrases and forgotten scrolls. But if one listens closely, the echoes of that forbidden tale still murmur through the halls of ancient Spain. Alfonso IX was a man divided between duty and obsession. He was born into the chaos of feuding Christian kingdoms, a time when Spain was torn by war and faith. From his youth, he was ambitious, proud, and restless. His advisors said he was born with the fire of conquest in his heart. But those who knew him privately spoke of another fire, one that burned far more dangerously. When he inherited the throne of Leon in the 12th century, he was already known for his charm and his temper. His people adored his courage on the battlefield, but feared his desires off it. Among his many liaisons and courtly loves, there was one woman who consumed him entirely, Berengaria of Castile. She was not only his cousin, some whispered, she was even closer than that, but also a princess of great beauty, a woman whose grace and intelligence matched his passion. At court gatherings, they could not hide their affection. Their glances lingered too long. Their conversations stretched too late into the night. Nobles murmured disapproval. Priests warned of sin. But Alfonso did not care. To him, Berengaria was not merely family, she was destiny. Their union, forbidden by both church and bloodline, became one of medieval Europe's most shocking romances. When they finally married in secret, the Pope himself condemned it as an act of perversion and blasphemy. He ordered the marriage annulled, threatening Alfonso with excommunication. Yet the king refused to submit. "If love is a sin," he reportedly told his council, "then I am the greatest sinner alive." He defied Rome, his bishops, even his own nobles, all for the woman he could not renounce. For years, They lived together as husband and wife, their forbidden bond hidden behind castle walls. The people whispered that God would punish them. Others believed their union was cursed from the start, and perhaps it was. Their kingdom grew divided. Church leaders denounced them in sermons, and the Pope sent letters demanding Alfonso's repentance. Under pressure, Berengaria, torn between faith and love, finally left him, taking their children with her. Some say she wept for years, her heart broken by the man who had risked his soul for her. But Alfonso could not forget. He became a man possessed, wandering through his palace like a ghost. He refused other brides, rejected alliances that could have strengthened his reign, and lived in defiance of both heaven and earth. His council begged him to remarry for the sake of the kingdom, but he only shook his head. There was only ever one queen, he said, and she was forbidden to me. In his later years, his obsession took darker turns. Chroniclers wrote that he surrounded himself with women who resembled Berengaria, forcing them to wear her perfume and dress in her colors. He built rooms decorated with her likeness, tapestries woven with her face, gold-framed portraits painted from memory. Servants said he spoke to these images at night, whispering apologies and confessions as though she stood before him. His lust had transformed into grief, and his grief into madness. The church saw his suffering as divine punishment, but Alfonso himself seemed to welcome it. "If hell is where she is," he once said, "then let that be my heaven." He died still clutching one of her letters, worn and faded, the ink almost gone. The priests who buried him said his lips moved in his final moments, speaking her name. No confession, no prayer, only the whisper of the love that damned him. And yet, in a strange twist of fate, their legacy did not end in sin. Their children, born of that forbidden union, went on to shape the destiny of Spain. Their son, Ferdinand III, became one of the most revered kings in Iberian history, a saint who united the warring kingdoms of Leon and Castile. It was as though heaven itself had taken the curse of their love and transformed it into redemption. Still, for centuries, the tale of Alfonso and Berengaria remained a warning whispered in monasteries that even kings could fall victim to their hearts. But beneath the judgment, there lingers something else, quiet sadness, a sense that love, even when condemned, has a power greater than any crown. Perhaps this is what makes history both tragic and beautiful, that its greatest sinners are also its most human. For in the dark halls of medieval castles, amid the prayers and the punishments, the same desires burned in royal hearts that burn in every mortal one, the longing to love, to possess, and to be remembered. When the night grows deep and the torches flicker low, the story of Alfonso and his forbidden queen feels less like a tale of perversion and more like a ghostly confession from another time. The sound of his voice still seems to echo in those old stone corridors, a king who broke every law for love and lost everything because of it. Long before the crowns of medieval kings gleamed under candlelight, there was another kind of ruler, one whose madness set the foundation for centuries of royal depravity. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history remembers him by a name that became synonymous with perversion itself, Caligula. Though not of the medieval age, his legacy of lust and insanity was whispered across generations, shaping the imaginations of rulers who came after. To the medieval mind, Caligula was more myth than man, the warning ghost of what unrestrained power could do to the human soul. The story of Caligula begins not with evil, but with innocence. As a child, he was adored by Roman soldiers who nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots, because he dressed like a miniature soldier in his father's army. The people loved him, believing he would one day restore the glory of Rome. When he finally rose to power in the year 37 AD, his first months as emperor were filled with generosity. He released prisoners, rewarded soldiers, and promised a new golden age. But power, like wine, can intoxicate even the noblest heart, and Caligula drank deeply from that cup. Soon, something changed. His laughter grew strange, his gaze distant. Chroniclers of his time whispered that a severe illness had shattered his mind, leaving behind not a man, but a monster in human form. When he recovered, he emerged reborn, not as emperor, but as God. He began to dress in shimmering robes of gold, appearing before the Senate barefoot, demanding they worship him as Jupiter incarnate. The man who once served Rome now demanded Rome serve his madness. His palace became a temple of debauchery. He built vast pleasure gardens filled with marble fountains, scented oils, and music that never stopped. The emperor hosted feasts that lasted for days, where nobles were forced to watch his most obscene performances. He indulged every whim, no matter how grotesque. He had wives of senators brought before him and claimed them in front of their husbands. He commanded noble women to strip and dance, mocking their virtue as the court applauded out of fear. Caligula believed that if he could own every man's wife, he could own every man's loyalty. The boundaries between pleasure and cruelty disappeared. He turned his own sisters, Drusilla, Agrippa, and Livilla, into objects of desire, forcing them into his private chambers, parading them before his court as goddesses. Some claimed he married his sister, Drusilla, in secret, declaring her a divine consort, while others believed he simply saw her as an extension of himself, the only person he truly loved. When she died suddenly, Caligula's grief erupted into madness. He forbade anyone in Rome to laugh or smile for weeks. He ordered the gods themselves to mourn her death, and when they did not, he desecrated their temples in rage. From that moment, his empire became a nightmare. He built bridges of ships across the sea just to walk across them, declaring himself master of the oceans. He slaughtered prisoners for entertainment, not in the arena, but during his dinner parties, simply to watch them die. He spent fortunes on statues of himself, ordering them placed in every temple. He forced priests to sacrifice to his image and replaced the heads of divine statues with his own. Rome, once the city of laws, became the stage for one man's insanity to the medieval chroniclers. Caligula's story was not ancient history, it was a prophecy. They saw in him the original sin of kingship, the belief that being chosen to rule was the same as being chosen to indulge. Monks in dimly lit monasteries copied his tale into their manuscripts, warning future rulers that Caligula's lust for power was the gateway to hell itself. But kings did not always heed such warnings. They read of him not with fear, but fascination. The idea of a ruler who could take whatever he wished without consequence became an unspoken fantasy in royal courts centuries later. Even as the centuries rolled forward and the world became cloaked in the solemn shadows of medieval faith, the ghost of Caligula lingered. In the flicker of every candle that lit a king's private chambers, There was a glimmer of his golden madness, the ancient belief that pleasure and power were divine rights. Caligula's reign ended as it was destined to, in blood. His own guards, driven by fear and disgust, conspired against him. One cold winter morning, as the emperor walked through the palace corridors, laughing at his own reflections in polished marble, a soldier stepped forward and plunged a blade into his chest. Others joined, striking him again and again, until the emperor, who thought himself immortal, lay dead in a pool of his own blood. Even in death, his face was said to wear a strange smile, as though he had achieved the ultimate ecstasy in destruction. But his death brought no peace to Rome. The people mourned, not for the man, but for what he had revealed, that behind every crown there lurked a heart capable of Caligula's madness. When medieval scholars later wrote of him, they described his soul wandering the underworld, still seeking pleasure among the dead, forever unsatisfied. For those who study the dark corners of history, Caligula stands as the beginning of an unbroken chain, a shadow stretching from ancient Rome to the castles of Europe. Every king who ever turned his throne into a bed of sin, every ruler who confused love with ownership, was walking in his footsteps. His name became a warning that no power, no beauty, and no lust can fill the void of a corrupted soul. And so, when you close your eyes and imagine the flickering torches of a medieval palace, remember that behind every jeweled crown, behind every whispered sin, there lingers the echo of that first emperor of excess, the man who called himself a god and died as a beast. In the cold, misty lands of 15th century Wallachia, where mountains cast long shadows and the forests whispered secrets to the wind, there lived a prince whose name would one day become legend, nightmare, and myth all at once. His name was Vlad III Dracula, known to history as Vlad the Imp. His story, retold by trembling monks and terrified travelers, blended cruelty with an almost sensual fascination with death. To the peasants of his realm, he was both protector and monster, a ruler whose thirst for punishment blurred into something darker, something that medieval chroniclers would later describe as lust for suffering. Vlad was born in a time when faith and violence slept in the same bed. His father, Vlad Dracul, had been a knight of the Order of the Dragon, sworn to defend Christendom against the Turks from birth. The boy was surrounded by the imagery of both piety and pain, iron crosses, banners dripping with red, and the heads of enemies displayed on spikes outside the castle gates. When he was still a child, he and his brother were taken hostage by the Ottoman Sultan, a twisted form of royal diplomacy. In the foreign palace, Vlad learned the arts of cruelty and control. He saw how power could bend men's souls, and something inside him began to warp. When he returned to his homeland years later, his heart was colder than the Carpathian winter. His kingdom was broken by corruption and treachery. Thieves ruled the streets, nobles plotted against the throne, and enemies crept across the borders. Vlad swore that he would cleanse his land, but the method he chose was not justice, it was terror. The forests of Wallachia became his court, and the stake became his throne. He devised punishments so gruesome that even his own soldiers trembled. Entire villages were impaled along the roadsides, men, women, and sometimes even the servants who had disobeyed an order. But to Vlad, this horror was more than politics. It was ritual, a ceremony of fear that both repelled and satisfied him. Witnesses wrote that as the bodies twisted in the wind, the prince would dine nearby in calm silence, the scent of blood mingling with roasted meat and spiced wine. To him, pain was art, and order was born only through terror. The chronicles of the time speak of feasts where he invited corrupt nobles to dine, only to lock the doors and have them executed mid-meal. His guests' screams became the music of his banquets. He believed that purity could only be achieved through suffering, that pain could cleanse sin. And yet, beneath this mask of righteousness, there was a disturbing pleasure. His letters described punishment in strangely intimate detail. When he spoke of impalement, he did not write like a ruler enforcing law, but like a man describing a performance. The people of Wallachia learned to fear the sound of hooves in the night. Stories spread of peasants found drained of blood, of enemies discovered with stakes driven through their bodies, and of the prince who smiled at the sight of it all. To the church, Vlad was both sinner and savior. He defended Christendom against the Ottomans, but his methods were closer to those of hell than heaven. Priests blessed him in public, but whispered prayers against him in secret. Yet for all his cruelty, there was another side to Vlad, the lonely prince, the man who desired affection as fiercely as he inflicted pain. He fell in love with a noblewoman whose name was lost to history. But when enemies stormed his castle, she threw herself into the river rather than fall into their hands. The story goes that when her body was found, Vlad's madness deepened beyond return. He ordered his enemies impaled in such numbers that the Danube ran red for days. The boundary between love and death vanished entirely for him. The pain of loss became indistinguishable from the pleasure of vengeance. Foreign ambassadors who visited his court described him as magnetic, even charming. His eyes, they said, were impossible to look away from, cold, bright, and full of calculation. He would speak softly, smile thinly, and then order an execution without a tremor. Some claimed that he believed suffering revealed truth, that a man's soul was purest when he screamed. It was said that after an execution, he would walk among the dying, watching the life leave their eyes, as though seeking to glimpse eternity in that final moment when his enemies finally turned against him. They used his own methods, betrayed by his nobles, captured by the Hungarians, and imprisoned in a tower. Vlad was left alone with his obsessions. The guards who brought him food claimed he built tiny impaled figures out of insects and rats, whispering to them as if they were courtiers. Years later, when he regained his throne briefly, the world had changed, but he had not. His reign ended in battle, his head severed and sent to the Sultan, but even death could not erase his legend. Centuries later, the name Dracula would echo through Europe, no longer as a prince, but as a myth, the immortal creature of the night. And while the tales of vampires may have softened his cruelty into fantasy, the truth beneath them remains. Vlad the Impaler was a man who turned the act of punishment into a perverse form of devotion. In his mind, to control the body was to own the soul. His lust was not for women or wine, but for power itself, for the ecstasy of domination and the trembling beauty of fear in the cold silence of history. Vlad stands as the embodiment of the ruler who confuses righteousness with desire, justice with torment. His story drifted into medieval lore as a symbol of how faith and cruelty can live side by side. The monks who wrote his chronicles must have done so with shaking hands, dipping their quills into ink as dark as the blood that once stained his forests. If you listen closely to the wind that howls through the Carpathian mountains, you might imagine it carrying the faint echo of his laughter, a reminder that some kings found pleasure not in love or glory, but in the exquisite stillness between a scream and silence. In the glittering heart of 17th century France, beneath ceilings painted with gods and angels, there stood the grandest palace the world had ever seen, Versailles. Its mirrored halls reflected not only light but vanity. Its fountains sang not only music but excess. And at the center of this golden world sat King Louis XIV, the Sun King, radiant, magnificent, and dangerously human. To the public, Louis was divinity in flesh. He ruled for 70 years, commanding armies, building monuments, and dazzling Europe with splendor. Yet, behind the walls of Versailles, hidden beneath layers of perfume and silk, there existed a kingdom of desire that few ever saw. The court was a theater of pleasure, and the king was both its playwright and its leading actor. Every day began with ritual. Courtiers gathered to watch the king wake, as if the sunrise itself depended on his opening eyes. Ladies curtsied, gentlemen bowed, and servants whispered prayers of loyalty. But when the formalities ended, when the corridors emptied and the doors were locked, the sacred ceremony of monarchy transformed into something entirely different. The king, who called himself the Light of France, craved more than worship. He craved possession. From his youth, Louis had been surrounded by beauty. His court was filled with women of extraordinary grace, each one competing for the privilege of his gaze. For them, love was politics. For him, politics was love. The Queen, Marie-Therese, played her role dutifully, bearing his children and enduring his betrayals in silence. But it was the king's mistresses, official and otherwise, who truly ruled his heart and shaped the fate of France. The first was Louise de la Vallière, sweet and devout, who loved him not for power, but for the man he once was. She wept after every stolen night, torn between sin and devotion. Her innocence fascinated him, but innocence cannot hold the attention of a man who thrives on indulgence. When her tears began to bore him, he turned his gaze to another, the brilliant and calculating Madame de Montespan. She was witty, proud, and utterly without fear. She transformed the king's passion into art, orchestrating secret feasts of pleasure where candlelight, wine, and whispered laughter blurred all boundaries of propriety. At these midnight gatherings, later called les petits soupers du roi, select courtiers were invited to dine in hidden chambers behind the Hall of Mirrors. Music played softly, perfumed smoke drifted through the air, and the king presided like a god of pleasure. The servants who poured the wine were sworn to silence. Those who spoke later vanished quietly from court. Versailles glittered with holiness by day and glowed with sin by night. Yet, behind this elegance, darker rumors spread. Some said Madame de Montespan visited fortune-tellers and dabblers in poison to keep the king's love. The infamous affair of the poisons soon engulfed the court. Whispers of black masses, enchanted powders, and secret rituals performed in candlelit rooms. The king's own mistress was accused of using sorcery to bind his desire. Though he never condemned her publicly, Louis withdrew from her bed soon after. his passions had turned to fear. Still, the hunger for pleasure did not fade. As the king aged, his mistresses grew younger. He surrounded himself with music, laughter, and the illusion of youth. Courtiers described him sitting by the fire at midnight, his face lined but glowing, as if lit from within by the embers of his memories. He would speak of love as a weapon, of loyalty as a game. He had learned that hearts could be conquered more easily than kingdoms to the outside world. Versailles was the pinnacle of civilization. To those who lived inside its golden cage, it was a world of masks, a place where every glance was calculated, every smile rehearsed. The king's perversions were not always of the flesh. Often they were of control. He delighted in watching his nobles compete for his attention, forcing them to surrender their pride in exchange for his favor. He seduced not only women, but an entire nation, making everyone dependent on his light. In the quiet hours of dawn, when even the fountains slept, the mighty Sun King would walk alone through his gardens. His steps echoed softly on the marble paths, and sometimes he would pause by the water and see his reflection shimmer in the dark. In that fleeting moment, stripped of glory and applause, he looked not like a god, but like a man haunted by the ghosts of all he had consumed. When Louis XIV finally died in 1715, after decades of luxury and conquest, his court wept more from habit than love. The grand mirrors of Versailles reflected not the face of the divine, but the truth of humanity, that even the brightest light casts the darkest shadow. The palace remained, its corridors filled with the perfume of vanished pleasures, its silence deeper than ever. Medieval chroniclers, writing long after his time, called him the king who worshipped himself. But perhaps it is more accurate to say that Louis was the king who mistook love for sunlight and burned everything that came too close. In the heart of Renaissance Rome, where marble saints watched over the streets and incense drifted like ghostly smoke through the basilica, there lived a man who wore the robes of holiness but walked the path of temptation. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, but history remembers him as Pope Alexander VI, the most scandalous pope to ever sit upon St. Peter's throne. It was a time when faith and greed danced together in the Vatican halls. Rome was not merely a city of prayer. It was a theater of ambition. Cardinals whispered promises, gold flowed like wine, and salvation could be bought if one had the right coin. Amidst this moral decay, Rodrigo Borgia rose, not through miracles or piety, but through power, charm, and corruption. He was handsome in his youth, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence that could silence a room. As a young cardinal, he was already infamous for his appetite. He loved food, wine, music, and above all, women. In the sacred corridors of the church, he pursued them with the same passion he used to pursue power. The Vatican, meant to be a house of God, became his personal palace of desire when he was elected Pope in 1492. It was not the will of heaven, but of gold that crowned him. He bribed the College of Cardinals with gifts, land, and promises. And when his coronation bells rang, the people of Rome whispered that the devil himself had just entered St. Peter's. But Alexander did not care. He believed that God's favor could coexist with pleasure. In his mind, sin was not rebellion. It was simply another form of creation. He had many mistresses, but one ruled above all, Vanessa de Catani. a noblewoman whose beauty was both fierce and refined. From their union came 4 children, the most notorious of whom were Cesare Borgia, the ruthless prince who inspired Machiavelli's The Prince, and Lucretia Borgia, whose name would become forever tangled with whispers of poison, passion, and forbidden love. The Pope adored his children openly, hosting grand feasts in their honor. Cardinals and ambassadors dined beneath frescoes of saints, while the Pope's illegitimate sons and daughters sat beside him, draped in jewels and velvet. The line between sacred and profane vanished completely. To the citizens of Rome, it was as if the Vatican had become a royal court rather than a holy seat. But what shocked the faithful most were the banquets of chestnuts. These were private gatherings within the papal apartments, where courtesans danced naked among tables piled high with food and gold. The guests, noblemen, priests, and even cardinals, competed in debauchery, while the Pope watched from his throne, laughing, his rings gleaming in the candlelight. Chroniclers later claimed that he gave prizes to those who performed best in these unholy contests. Yet, Alexander VI was not merely a man of indulgence. He was a master of politics. Between bouts of revelry, he schemed tirelessly to expand his family's power. He used his papal authority to grant territories to his son Cesare and arranged marriages for Lucretia that strengthened alliances across Italy. He turned the church into a dynasty, a weapon wrapped in silk. Those who defied him met quiet ends. Enemies were poisoned, rivals exiled, and secrets buried beneath Rome's marble floors. The Borgia name became synonymous with both brilliance and blood. Even his own daughter, Lucretia, was rumored to carry a hollow ring filled with poison, a deadly kiss disguised as jewelry. Whether true or not, the rumor reflected the atmosphere of his reign: beauty concealing corruption, holiness masking desire. The Pope's palace became the center of Europe's gossip. Artists, poets, and assassins all walked the same corridors. Leonardo da Vinci and Niccolo Machiavelli both crossed paths with Cesare Borgia, 2 geniuses drawn to the magnetism of sin and power. The Renaissance bloomed outside the Vatican walls, but within them a darker Renaissance unfolded, one of ambition, lust, and secrecy. Still, Alexander VI believed himself chosen by God. He prayed daily, celebrated Mass, and spoke often of salvation. But his prayers were as ornate as his feasts, filled with self-justification. God made beauty, he once said, and beauty is not meant to be denied. To him, indulgence was not weakness, it was divine privilege. As he aged, his sins began to circle him like vultures. His son Cesare grew too powerful, his enemies multiplied, and his health began to fade. In 1503, during one of his grand banquets, the Pope and his son drank from a bottle of wine meant to poison a rival cardinal. The poison worked, but on them, the Pope died soon after, his body swelling grotesquely, the smell of death spreading through the Vatican before the bells even stopped ringing. Cesare survived, but barely. Rome rejoiced. The people dragged his name through the streets, shouting that the devil had finally claimed his own. And yet, centuries later, historians would look back and find in Alexander VI not just a monster, but a mirror, a reflection of an age when beauty, power, and sin were inseparable. He turned the church into a court of pleasure and the Pope's crown into a crown of contradictions. He proved that holiness, when mixed with hunger, could become the most dangerous form of desire. Even now, the Vatican walls that once echoed with his laughter stand silent, as if ashamed to remember. Beneath the painted ceilings of Rome, beneath the gold and marble, lies the ghost of a man who kissed the cross with one hand and the flesh of lovers with the other. In the stillness of night, when the city sleeps, one might imagine his voice whispering through the corridors. Power, he says, is the sweetest sin of all. In the misty, candlelit courts of 16th century England, where the scent of rose oil mingled with the iron smell of ambition, there lived a king who ruled not only with power, but with appetite. His name was Henry VIII, and his story is a long confession written in blood, silk, and broken vows. To the world, he was a monarch. To history, he became something stranger, a man who reshaped a faith just to satisfy his desire. Henry was not born cruel. In his youth, he was radiant, tall, athletic, and charming, with a mind eager for theology and music. He composed songs, rode in tournaments, and quoted scripture with the confidence of a man certain of God's favor. His courtiers called him the perfect prince. But beneath the golden armor of his youth burned a restlessness that even the crown could not calm. He wanted everything: glory, loyalty, and above all, love that obeyed him. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, was noble, dignified, and deeply pious. Their marriage, sealed by papal blessing, united England with Spain, bringing stability to the kingdom. For years, Henry adored her, but as time passed, their love turned heavy. The queen aged, her pregnancies ended in heartbreak, and no surviving son came to secure his legacy. Each cradle that stood empty became a silent wound to his pride. Then came Anne Boleyn, dark-eyed, clever, and dangerously captivating. She was not the typical court beauty. She refused to be a mistress, demanded respect, and spoke to the king as an equal. In her words, Henry found challenge. In her eyes, temptation. She made him feel young again, alive, chosen. Soon his prayers began to twist around her name, but there was a problem. The church forbade him from divorcing his queen. His marriage, sanctified by the Pope himself, could not be undone by mortal will. Yet Henry's will was no longer mortal in his own eyes. He was a king, anointed by God, and no man, not even the Pope, could deny him. So, with lust and pride as his compass, he broke from Rome. He created a new church, the Church of England, declaring himself its supreme head in one sweeping act of rebellion disguised as holiness. Henry severed England from centuries of Catholic faith, all to make Anne Boleyn his queen. The people watched in silence as monasteries were stripped, abbots executed, and the wealth of the church flowed into the royal treasury. It was a revolution, not of ideology, but of desire. The king's love became law. His obsession became religion. Anne was crowned queen amid roaring crowds and dark omens. Bells rang, but many whispered that her coronation carried a curse. For a time, she dazzled the court, sharp-tongued and brilliant, bearing Henry a daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth I, but no son. And as her beauty began to fade, the king's affection turned cold. The same charm that had enthralled him now provoked his anger. Jealousy poisoned the palace air. Spies whispered of betrayal, of lovers, of secrets. Whether true or invented, Henry believed them all. Anne was arrested, accused of adultery, witchcraft, and treason, charges stitched together with fear and convenience. In May of 1536, she was led to the scaffold within the Tower of London. The executioner knelt before her, and she forgave him. A single stroke of the sword ended both her life and Henry's last illusion of love. He remarried quickly, then again and again. 6 wives in total, each a chapter in his descent. Some he loved, some he despised, and to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard he beheaded. To the people, the pattern became prophecy. To be chosen by the king was to walk toward death in jewels. But the most haunting part of Henry's story is not his cruelty, it is his loneliness. As the years wore on, his body grew heavy, his legs ulcered, and his once proud face became a mask of bitterness. He surrounded himself with music, yet silence followed him. He stared at the portraits of his lost queens, perhaps remembering moments when he had truly believed in love. But love, to Henry, had always been something to conquer, not cherish. In his final years, he was haunted by ghosts. At night, servants heard him murmuring names, Catherine, Anne, Jane, as though trying to confess to someone who would never forgive him. The man who defied the church, who defied Rome itself, could not defy his own guilt. When he died in 1547, the bells of England tolled not in celebration, but in weary relief. His reign had changed everything, the nation, the faith, and the meaning of power. But in his heart, Henry had built his own prison, a kingdom born from passion, ruled by pride, and buried under the weight of his own desires. Today, his portrait still hangs in galleries across Europe. The broad shoulders, the jeweled coat, the cold, commanding eyes. People stand before it, fascinated, almost hypnotized. Few remember that behind those eyes lived a man who tore down a religion to feed a hunger that no crown, no queen, and no earthly power could ever satisfy. In the cold marble corridors of 14th century France, where torches flickered against tapestries of saints and warriors, there ruled a man whose face was carved from stone and whose heart beat to the rhythm of vengeance. His name was Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, not for kindness, but for the pale, flawless beauty of his face. Behind those calm blue eyes, however, was a ruler whose obsessions would destroy one of the holiest orders in Christendom and stain the crown of France forever. Philip was a strange king. He spoke little, moved rarely, and smiled almost never. Courtiers said that standing before him felt like standing before a statue, magnificent, motionless, and merciless. He ruled with the conviction of a man chosen by God, yet his soul was bound to greed, pride, and suspicion. His kingdom was rich, but his appetite for gold was endless. And when the treasury emptied, his eyes turned to war, those who had more. The Knights Templar. The Templars were the warrior monks of Europe, guardians of pilgrims, defenders of the Holy Land, and bankers to kings. Over 2 centuries, they had grown powerful beyond measure, too powerful for Philip's comfort. They owned land, castles, and secrets. The Pope himself trusted them, but to Philip, they were an empire within his own, and he could not bear to share power. In 1307, he struck. On a single dawn in October, his soldiers swept through France, arresting hundreds of Templars. Their leader, Grand Master Jacques de Maule, was taken in chains. The charges were shocking: heresy, sorcery, idolatry, and more scandalously, acts of unnatural sin performed in secret initiation rites. The accusations spread like wildfire. The world that had once bowed to the Templars now turned away in disgust. Under torture, the knights confessed to everything and nothing. Some said they spat on the cross. Others said they worshipped a demon's head. Some whispered of forbidden brotherhoods, of midnight rituals where the boundaries of faith and flesh blurred. Whether these confessions were truth or invention mattered little. Philip had what he wanted: the justification to destroy them. But why such fury? Some said it was greed, that he coveted their gold. Others whispered that the Templars possessed secrets, relics of Christ, hidden texts, or knowledge that could unmake kings. Yet beneath every political reason lay something deeper, more personal. Philip's obsession with purity was the mirror image of his own hidden corruption. He ruled through priests and piety, but his court was filled with intrigue, cruelty, and silent sins. In condemning the Templars, he cleansed himself in illusion. The trials dragged on for years. Men who had once ridden proudly beneath the Red Cross were now starved, broken, and burned. The Pope, terrified of Philip's power, dissolved the order entirely. Their lands and treasures were seized, their legacy erased by decree. But the story did not end in the courtroom. In March 1314, on an island in the Seine, Jacques de Malle and another Templar leader were led to the stake. Before the flames rose, Malle spoke. His voice was calm, clear, almost serene. He declared his innocence and called down a curse upon those who had condemned them: the Pope, the King, and all their descendants. Then the fire was lit. Witnesses said the smell of burning flesh drifted across Paris, mingling with the cold river air. Within a year, both the Pope and King Philip were dead. The Pope's body rotted before burial. Philip fell during a hunt. His neck snapped. His sons, who succeeded him, one after another, died young, leaving the Capetian dynasty broken. To the people, it was divine retribution, the Templar curse fulfilled. Yet, if you look closer, you find that Philip's downfall began long before the curse. The same hunger that drove him to destroy the Templars consumed his soul from within. He had turned holiness into a weapon, and faith into fear. His reign was a masquerade of virtue, behind which lurked a lust for control that no amount of gold or prayer could satisfy. Even his family was not spared. His daughters-in-law were caught in a scandal known as the Tour de Nesle affair, accused of adultery. Philip ordered them imprisoned and their lovers executed, castrated, flayed, and hanged. He called it justice, but it was revenge disguised as righteousness. The man who had condemned others for sin could not bear the reflection of sin within his own house. Historians call him the Cold King, a ruler of ice. But ice melts, and when it does, it reveals what it has hidden. Philip's legacy was not purity, but decay. He left behind a kingdom divided by suspicion, a church weakened by manipulation, and a dynasty cursed by the very fire he had kindled. And yet, there is something haunting about his end. They say that when Philip's body was laid in the cathedral, a great storm struck Paris. The wind howled through the stained glass, rattling the candles. And some swore they saw the ghostly shapes of knights standing in the shadows, silent, watching, waiting. Centuries later, the name Philip the Fair still echoes through the corridors of European memory. His portrait shows a man of perfect symmetry, the face of an angel carved from stone. But those who look long enough can almost see the flicker beneath the surface, the faint reflection of fire, the ghost of guilt, and the unending question of whether his curse was real or simply the punishment of conscience. The Templars may have burned, but Philip's name burns, still a warning that even the holiest crown can hide the darkest sin, and that some kings destroy not for lust of the body, but for lust of the soul. In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble columns reached toward the sun and the scent of wine, sweat and burning oil drifted through the air, there ruled an emperor who turned his city into a stage for his desires. His name was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but to history, he is simply known as Nero, the emperor who sang as Rome burned, and who turned the empire of law and reason into a theater of madness and indulgence. When Nero first came to power, he was barely 17, a golden-haired youth guided by philosophers and flatterers. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, had clawed her way to the throne for him, a woman of ruthless ambition and dangerous beauty. She had married her own uncle, Emperor Claudius, poisoned him, and placed her son upon the throne. Nero owed her everything, but he soon learned that a mother's love in Rome was never pure. It was a contract written in blood and expectation. At first, Rome adored him. He reduced taxes, supported the arts, and presented himself as a new kind of ruler, sensitive, poetic, and merciful. He sang to the people, performed on stage, and recited poetry under moonlight. The senators frowned, but the crowds cheered. To them, Nero was not just an emperor, he was a spectacle. Yet, behind this charm was a growing hunger, not for conquest, but for attention. As the years passed, that hunger deepened into something darker. Nero began to see himself not as a man, but as a god. His pleasures became rituals, his cruelty, performance. His palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, was a monument to his vanity, with ceilings of gold leaf, walls covered in jewels, and artificial lakes reflecting his likeness from every angle. Inside, he hosted feasts that lasted for days. Guests reclined on silver couches while naked servants poured wine and played flutes. The air was heavy with incense and roses, the sound of laughter muffled by the rustle of silk and the clinking of goblets. Nero's love life was as twisted as his politics. His first wife, Octavia, was kind and patient, but he found her dull. He accused her of infidelity and ordered her executed. Then came Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty was said to silence entire rooms. She understood Nero's desires to be adored, worshipped, and feared. But she also understood how to control him, whispering poison into his ear until he turned against his closest allies, including his own mother. Agrippina had grown too powerful, too demanding. She believed that Rome owed her loyalty, that her son ruled because of her hand. But Nero wanted to be free. He plotted her death as if composing a play. First, a collapsing ceiling, then a sabotaged ship meant to drown her. When both failed, he sent assassins. She met her end with chilling calm, baring her chest and saying, "Strike here, the womb that bore him." And so they did. After that, Nero's descent quickened. He roamed the city in disguise at night, breaking into shops, harassing women, and fighting strangers in the streets. His guards followed, ensuring no one ever fought back. He built theaters where he forced senators to applaud his singing. He raced chariots in public games, demanding cheers as if applause were proof of immortality. Then came the Great Fire of Rome. It began in the summer of 64 CE, raging for 9 days, devouring temples, homes, and markets. Thousands died, and the city's heart was reduced to ash. People whispered that Nero had ordered the fire himself to clear space for a new palace, that he had stood on a balcony, playing his lyre and singing of Troy's destruction as his own city burned. Whether true or myth, it fit too well with his legend to be forgotten. To divert blame, Nero accused the Christians, a small, persecuted sect already despised by the Roman elite. He had them rounded up, tortured, and executed in grotesque displays. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were set aflame to light his gardens at night. The emperor watched from his balcony as human torches burned below, his face calm, illuminated by their screams. But Rome's patience wore thin. His endless extravagance drained the treasury, and his paranoia turned friends into enemies. He executed senators, generals, even musicians who dared outshine him. When rebellion finally rose, he found himself abandoned. His guards fled, his allies betrayed him, and his empire, once his stage, became silent on the night of his death. Nero hid in a villa outside the city, trembling as soldiers closed in. He wept, muttering, "What an artist dies in me." When no one would strike him, he drove a dagger into his own throat. The last sound he made was not a cry, but a sigh, as though exhausted by his own drama. Yet his ghost lingered. For generations, Romans claimed to see him wandering at dusk, singing softly. His golden crown melted into the shadow of his guilt. His palaces crumbled. His name became synonymous with ruin. But his legend endured. The emperor who mistook his empire for a mirror and mistook applause for love. In Nero's story lies the oldest truth of power, that pleasure, when unrestrained, devours itself. He ruled not to build, but to feel, to burn bright, even if it meant burning everything around him. Rome survived him, but it never forgot the glow of that fire or the music that played as it burned. In the mist-shrouded courts of Tudor England, where the scent of ink and candle wax lingered over documents that could decide life or death, one man stood as both king and storm. His name was Henry VIII, and though history remembers him as the founder of the Church of England, the truth of his reign is written not in Holy Scripture, but in the bodies and broken hearts of those who loved him. Henry's story is not merely one of politics or faith, it is a tale of hunger. A hunger so vast it devoured wives, friends, and even an entire religion. When Henry first took the throne in 1509, he was a young man of 27, handsome, athletic, and full of charm. He loved hunting, music, and tournaments. His laughter filled the palace halls, and his charisma was a flame around which everyone wanted to stand close, even if it meant being burned. At his side stood Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who had already known tragedy. She had been married once before to Henry's brother, Arthur, who died soon after their wedding. When Henry married her, he vowed it was destiny, ordained by God himself. For years, they lived in apparent harmony, and Catherine bore him children, though most died in infancy. Only one survived, Mary, but to Henry, a daughter was not enough. He needed a son to carry his blood, his name, his dream of an unbroken dynasty. And when fate refused to give him one, he began to see divine betrayal in every misfortune. Then came Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed England forever. She was not the most beautiful woman at court, but she had a mind as sharp as a blade and eyes that could challenge a king. Unlike other ladies who fluttered around him, Anne withheld herself, refusing to be another conquest. She wanted more marriage, crown, power. Henry, enchanted and enraged, promised her all three. Yet there was one obstacle. He was still married to Catherine. Divorce was forbidden by the Church, and Pope Clement VII, fearing the wrath of Catherine's powerful relatives in Spain, refused to grant it. But Henry was not a man who accepted denial. He declared that no foreign bishop had authority over him. He tore England away from the Roman Church, named himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and took Anne as his wife. For love or perhaps obsession, he changed the course of his nation. But the dream soured quickly. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, but no son followed. Henry's passion turned to suspicion. He accused Anne of adultery, treason, and witchcraft claims built on whispers and lies. In 1536, she was executed by sword in the Tower of London. As the blade fell, the crowd was silent, and Henry, far away, prepared for another wedding. His court became a revolving door of queens. Jane Seymour, gentle and quiet, gave him the son he longed for, but died soon after childbirth. Her death plunged him into mourning so deep that even his courtiers feared to speak his name aloud. But grief never lasted long for Henry. He married Anne of Cleves, a German princess chosen from a portrait. When she arrived, Henry was disgusted, claiming she looked nothing like her picture. He divorced her after 6 months and married Catherine Howard, a young woman barely in her teens, full of laughter and naivety. To Henry, she was youth reborn. To her, he was a monstrous relic of power. When her infidelity was discovered, she met the same fate as Anne Boleyn, her head severed beneath the cold English sky. His final wife, Catherine Parr, was more nurse than lover, tending to the obese and ailing king who had once been the pride of Europe by the end of his life. Henry was no longer the golden prince he had been. His legs were swollen with ulcers, his body bloated, his heart a furnace of bitterness. He surrounded himself with portraits of his youth, as if to remind himself of the man he had once been. He grew paranoid, seeing betrayal in every shadow, executing old friends and advisors who had once helped him reshape the world. Even as he slept, the echo of church bells and screams haunted him, the ghostly rhythm of wives betrayed and vows broken. Yet, in the stillness of his dying days, perhaps even Henry knew that he had traded his soul for something fleeting. His legacy was not peace or piety, but division and desire. The England he left behind was changed forever, freer, yet scarred by the cracks of his ego. And as centuries passed, his name became legend. Some saw him as a hero of independence, others as a tyrant, blinded by lust and power. But perhaps he was both a man who loved too fiercely, who mistook his wants for destiny, and who believed that to be king was to possess everything, even love itself. When the candle finally burned low beside his bed, and the sound of the court faded into silence, Henry's breath came like a bellows, shallow and heavy. "They said," he muttered, the names of his wives in delirium, one after another, as though he could not remember which one had truly loved him. Or perhaps he realized none had ever truly known the man behind the crown. For all his wealth and power, he died alone, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. And somewhere in the echoes of Hampton Court, where music once played for royal banquets and lovers' whispers danced against the walls, the spirit of the Tudor king still lingers, searching, perhaps, for the affection he could never command, and the peace that no crown could buy. In the glittering heart of 18th century France, beyond the golden gates of Versailles, where sunlight danced upon marble fountains and perfumes lingered like secrets, there lived a king whose charm masked a nation slowly collapsing beneath its own pleasure. His name was Louis XV, known once as Louis the Well-Beloved, but time would twist that affection into irony. For beneath the powder and satin of his court lay a hunger that hollowed his throne. Louis was only 5 years old when he became king. The child who inherited an empire was quiet, shy, and watchful, a lonely figure wandering through the endless corridors of the palace that would one day become both his paradise and his prison. Raised among tutors and courtiers who bowed too deeply and whispered too softly, he grew to see affection not as a gift, but as a performance. And so, as he became a man, he sought love the only way he knew, through the rituals of power. At first, Louis was a diligent ruler, devoted to his duties. He listened to his ministers, studied reports, and cared deeply for his people. But kings are not born immune to isolation, and the gilded cage of Versailles soon began to close around him. Every gesture was watched, every smile noted, every word recorded. Surrounded by courtiers who adored his crown more than his soul, Louis began to retreat into the softer realms of comfort music, hunting, and the company of women. Versailles was a place of beauty, but also of boredom. Its halls, lined with mirrors and chandeliers, reflected not joy, but emptiness. And into that emptiness crept temptation. Louis's first love was his wife, Marie Laszyska, a Polish princess of quiet virtue. But over the years, her gentle presence became a shadow in his grand life. The court, ever hungry for gossip, pushed him toward new fascinations. Among them rose a woman whose name would echo through history, Madame de Pompadour. She was not born noble. She was a merchant's daughter, educated, clever, and radiant in a way that defied birthright. She understood Louis better than anyone, his melancholy, his wariness, his yearning for beauty and admiration. She became not just his mistress, but his confidant, his advisor, his mirror. Under her influence, art flourished, architecture blossomed, and the court became a stage of elegance and wit. She tamed his loneliness, even as she fed it. But Versailles was a cruel stage. Behind the music and laughter, there was always the whisper of scandal. When Madame de Pompadour's health began to fail, Louis's desires sought new faces, younger, fresher, as though chasing the ghost of his own lost youth. He built a secret house on the edge of the palace grounds, the Parc aux Cerfs, where young women were brought in secrecy to please the aging king. To the outside world, Louis remained the polished monarch, his powdered wig and jeweled cane symbols of refinement. But within those hidden chambers, the air grew thick with perfume and pretense, the laughter hollow, the eyes fearful dot. As the years turned, so too did the whispers of the people. The streets of Paris darkened with hunger, while Versailles sparkled brighter than ever. Bread grew scarce, taxes rose, and the common folk began to see their king not as the well-beloved, but as the indifferent puppet of pleasure. Yet Louis, insulated by silk and ceremony, barely noticed. He filled his days with hunting and his nights with feasts, his soul lulled by music and adoration. To him, the world outside the gilded gates was a rumor, distant and unreal. But even in Versailles, time could not be denied. The mirrors began to lose their shine, the gardens their color. Madame de Pompadour died in 1764. Her final words, a whisper of apology for not living long enough to serve him more. Louis wept, but his tears, like his rain, faded quickly. New favorites came and went. Among them, the infamous Madame du Barry, whose beauty was matched only by her ambition. The court sneered, the priests condemned, but Louis, weary of morality, simply smiled. He had become the embodiment of the kingdom's contradictions, powerful yet fragile, adored yet despised, surrounded by splendor yet empty within. As his body aged and his heart weakened, even the palace seemed to sigh with exhaustion. The laughter grew thinner, the candles dimmer. Servants moved like ghosts through corridors that once rang with music. Louis would sit alone for hours, staring at the fountains beyond his window, their rhythm a distant echo of his fading pulse. Perhaps, in those quiet moments, he understood the truth that had eluded him all his life, that a kingdom cannot be ruled from a bed of roses, and that pleasure is a poor substitute for peace. When smallpox claimed him in 1774, the irony was complete. The same people who had once called him beloved now refused to touch his corpse. His body was hurriedly buried, the crowds cheering in the streets as his coffin disappeared into the night. Yet, within the empty chambers of Versailles, the air remained heavy with his presence, the scent of his colognes, the echo of his sighs, the ghost of his charm. For in the end, Louis XV was not a monster nor a saint, but something far more tragic, a man who mistook affection for adoration and desire for destiny. His sins were not of cruelty, but of indulgence. And through him, the world saw how beauty, when hoarded, turns to decay, and how an empire built on silk and secrecy can crumble long before the stones begin to fall. The courtiers who had once bowed before him moved on to serve his grandson, Louis XVI, who would face the fury his grandfather's apathy had sown. The revolution that would one day shake the world began not with swords, but with sighs, with the exhaustion of a people watching their king vanish into his pleasures while their bellies starved. And so the story of Louis XV became a warning, written in perfume and gold leaf, that no amount of beauty can hide rot forever, and no crown, no matter how brilliant, can protect a heart consumed by its own emptiness. In the vast, frozen reaches of medieval Russia, where the winter sky hung low and the bells of Moscow tolled through the snow like the heartbeat of a slumbering giant, there rose a boy who would one day make the world tremble at his name. He was born Ivan Vasilievich in 1530, heir to the throne of Muscovy and orphaned before his 10th birthday. His father's death left him surrounded not by guardians, but by vultures' noble families who schemed for power, while the child Sir watched from behind gilded screens, his eyes cold and silent. They starved him, mocked him, ignored him. He saw courtiers beat his servants for sport, Priests whisper lies, and soldiers drag children from their homes. And somewhere in those lonely corridors, the seed of his cruelty took root. When Ivan was just 16, he did something no Russian ruler had ever dared. He crowned himself Tsar, a title drawn from the ancient Roman Caesar. It was a declaration to heaven and earth that his rule came not from men, but from God himself. At first, his reign promised greatness. He built cathedrals, strengthened law, and expanded the empire beyond imagination. The people celebrated him as a visionary, a warrior blessed by divine right. Yet beneath that crown, the boy who had been abandoned never disappeared. He merely learned to wear masks. One moment, Ivan would pray with trembling hands in candlelit churches, tears streaming down his face as choirs sang. The next, he would erupt into rages so violent that even his closest advisors feared to breathe. He trusted no one, for he had learned early that love was a weapon. His beautiful wife, Anastasia Romanovna, was the only soul who calmed the storm within him. Her gentleness kept the demons at bay, and as long as she lived, Russia flourished. But in 1560, she fell ill and died suddenly. Ivan's heart cracked like ice beneath a heavy footstep. He became convinced that she had been poisoned by the boyars, the noble class he already despised. From that moment, the Tsar's eyes no longer saw men and women, but traitors and ghosts. He withdrew from Moscow for months, vanishing into the forests, leaving his empire to shiver without its master. When he returned, it was not as the man they once knew. He rode through the Kremlin in black robes, surrounded by a private army known as the Oprichnika men, dressed in black. Their saddles adorned with brooms and dog heads to symbolize how they would sweep away treachery and sniff out betrayal. They became his instruments of terror, riding through towns and villages, leaving behind only silence and smoke. Ivan began purging anyone he suspected of disloyalty: boyars, priests, merchants, peasants. Entire cities were punished for imagined sins. In the winter of 1570, he descended upon Novgorod, accusing it of treason. What followed was a horror even his soldiers could scarcely comprehend. The Oprichniki sealed the city gates and began their cleansing. They dragged families to the frozen river, tied them together, and threw them beneath the ice. Monks were burned in their monasteries, the air filled with the sound of bells tolling for the dead, but even the churches could not escape his wrath. When it was over, Novgorod was a graveyard, and Ivan rode away through the falling snow, silent and unmoved. But his cruelty was not only political, it was personal. He turned against his friends, his advisors, even his own kin. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, was everything the Tsar once had been: strong, intelligent, beloved by the people. But pride and paranoia do not share a throne. In a moment of fury, Ivan struck his son with his staff during an argument, killing him instantly. When he realized what he had done, he collapsed beside the body, cradling it, wailing like a man who had finally met his own reflection. That moment would haunt him forever. The portrait of Ivan clutching his dying son, painted centuries later, still freezes the heart, one of the few images that captures the raw madness of power turned inward by the end of his reign. Ivan had become a ghost within his own empire, his hair thinned, his face hollowed, and his mind filled with whispers. He ordered endless executions, then prayed for the souls of the dead. He saw devils in his dreams and saints in his mirrors. He built churches to atone for murders and ordered murders to silence guilt. The line between piety and cruelty blurred until even the priests no longer knew which side of him they were speaking to. Yet beneath the horror, there was something profoundly human, a loneliness so vast it swallowed empires. When death finally came for him in 1584, it was strangely gentle. He was playing chess, the one game that still gave his restless mind focus. As he reached for a piece, his hand froze mid-air and he collapsed. The courtiers who found him said his face was peaceful, almost childlike, as though the tyrant had finally found rest. But Russia did not rest. His legacy was chaos, a kingdom scarred, a people traumatized, a shadow that would hang over the czars for generations. Ivan the Terrible remains one of history's most haunting rulers, not merely for his cruelty, but for the mirror he holds up to power itself. His reign shows how easily fear becomes faith, how grief becomes vengeance, and how the child abandoned in the cold can grow into the man who burns cities to feel warm again. And so, in the frozen silence of old Russia, where cathedrals still glitter like frost beneath the stars, the name Ivan still carries a whisper of awe and dread, a reminder that the crown, once placed upon a trembling head, can never be removed without blood. Long before the cathedrals of Europe rose, and before the kings of England and France learned the taste of absolute power, there stood Rome, the beating heart of the world, its streets paved with ambition and blood, and within its palaces of marble and gold, there lived an emperor who turned divine rule into desecration. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history remembers him by the nickname whispered by soldiers Caligula, meaning little boot. It began innocently enough, a term of affection given to him as a child following his father on military campaigns, dressed in miniature armor, adored by the legions. But affection in Rome was fleeting, and adoration often hid envy. By the time he became emperor in 37 AD, Caligula's innocence had already been buried beneath years of fear, grief, and intrigue. He was the son of Germanicus, a celebrated general beloved by the people, and Agrippina the elder, a woman whose pride matched her beauty. When his father died under suspicious circumstances, his family was destroyed by the paranoid emperor Tiberius. Caligula grew up among corpses, his mother exiled, his brothers murdered, his sisters scattered. He learned early that Rome's greatest weapon was not the sword, but the whisper. For years, he lived as a guest, some said prisoner of Tiberius, on the island of Capri, a place where pleasure and cruelty were indistinguishable. There, amid the feasts and punishments of a dying emperor, young Caligula smiled and learned to survive. He watched and waited, and when Tiberius finally died, he inherited not only an empire, but the madness that ruled it. At first, Rome rejoiced. Caligula was handsome, generous, and charismatic. He freed political prisoners, ended treason trials, and threw lavish games in honor of the gods. The people adored him, the Senate praised him, and poets compared him to the divine. Yet beneath his golden smile was something hollow, something trembling. After a sudden illness in the first year of his reign, perhaps fever, perhaps poison, he changed. The man who awoke from that sickness was no longer entirely human, or at least no longer believed he was. Caligula began to see himself not as a man chosen by the gods, but as a god in flesh. He demanded temples built in his honor, priests to serve him, and sacrifices made in his name. He appeared in public, dressed as Mercury, as Apollo, as Venus, blurring the lines between divinity and delirium. He ordered the heads of statues of Jupiter to be replaced with his own likeness. His palace became a shrine to excess floors covered in jewels, fountains of wine, feasts that lasted for days. He scattered gold coins to watch the people crawl on the ground to retrieve them. He said it amused him to see how the rich and poor alike would debase themselves for the illusion of favor. But the same crowds that once shouted his name began to whisper in fear. His punishments grew unpredictable. Senators who displeased him were forced to dine beside him one night and executed the next morning. He took wives from their husbands on a whim, declaring their beauty wasted. He humiliated nobles by making their fortunes depend on dice rolls or cruel jokes. He emptied the treasury to fund his entertainments and ordered bridges of ships to be built across the sea so that he could ride his horse, Insidious, over the waves like Neptune himself. The horse became a symbol of his madness. He lavished it with marble stables, jeweled collars, and servants. Some claimed he planned to make it a consular senator of Rome, though perhaps it was not madness but mockery, a cruel reminder to the Senate that their titles meant nothing to him. Caligula's reign became theater, a performance of power so absolute it devoured itself. He trusted no one, for how can a god trust mortals? He accused his sisters of betrayal, exiled them, and then, in grief or guilt, worshipped them as divine beings. His nights were restless, haunted by visions of his murdered family and the laughter of ghosts. He once said he could hear the ocean whispering his name and the moon following his chariot across the sky. Rome itself began to tremble under the weight of his delusions. He declared wars that never happened, returning from campaigns with no enemy defeated, but parading seashells as spoils of Neptune. He drained the empire's wealth on spectacles of blood and beauty, mixing religion and madness until even his loyal guards feared to speak. Yet, within the horror was tragedy, a man who had been born surrounded by betrayal, who saw death in every smile, and who believed that only by becoming a god could he escape the fate of men. The end came, as it always does, from within. In 41 AD, after just 4 years of rule, the whispers turned into blades. His own guards, led by the Praetorian Cassius Chaerea, ambushed him in a passage beneath the palace. They struck him down as he screamed, more in disbelief than pain. "I am still alive," he is said to have gasped before the final blow. His blood stained the marble that once reflected his vanity, and with it ended one of Rome's darkest performances. His wife and child were killed soon after. The Senate erased his memory, and yet the shadow of Caligula remained lingering like perfume after decay. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Caligula was mad, evil, or merely the product of a world where power had grown too absolute for the human mind to contain. Perhaps he was all three. His life reads like a caution written in blood and gold, that when men begin to believe they are gods, they lose the ability to be human. Even now, when the ruins of Rome glow beneath the setting sun, and the wind sighs through its broken arches, it feels as though his ghost still wanders there laughing, lonely, searching for an audience that will never again applaud. In the late 18th century, when Europe's candlelit courts glittered with powdered wigs and painted smiles, Denmark stood quietly among the northern winds, its palaces cold yet gilded, its rulers caught between reason and ruin. There, within the ornate chambers of Christiansborg Palace, lived a young king whose soul seemed to flicker like a candle in a draught. His name was Christian VII of Denmark, a monarch crowned not with glory but with ghosts. Born into royal luxury, yet deprived of love, he ascended the throne in 1766. At just 17, a boy too fragile for the weight of a crown, his reign would become one of the strangest stories in Europe, a tragedy painted in silk and madness, where the court's whispers were louder than its prayers. Christian's childhood had been a quiet cruelty. His father, King Frederick V, was distant and indulgent, more fond of drink than duty, while his mother, Queen Louise, died when he was only 11. The boy was raised by tutors who mistook fear for discipline. They called him delicate, unstable, unfit. They forced him to study, while other princes learned how to command, and when he rebelled, they called it insanity. But behind his nervous laughter and erratic fits lay a loneliness so deep it turned inward, feeding on itself until his mind began to warp. By the time he was crowned, the young king already displayed signs of something deeply wrong. He would laugh for hours at nothing, whisper to invisible friends, and perform cruel pranks on his courtiers as though to test the boundaries between jest and power. At first, the court pretended not to notice. They had seen eccentric kings before. They called him charming, mercurial, unpredictable. But as the months passed, the illusions became impossible to maintain. Christian's nights were consumed by pleasure and paranoia. He attended masquerades in disguise, prowled the streets of Copenhagen, and sought entertainment in the company of actresses, courtesans, and strangers who flattered his vanity. He spoke openly of his fascination with vice, declaring that the body was a kingdom of its own, and pleasure its only ruler behind the palace walls. He surrounded himself with jesters and flatterers, men who encouraged his excesses for their own gain. His queen, the beautiful Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, arrived full of hope, a young woman barely 16, gentle and intelligent, believing she could be the partner who steadied him. But she soon discovered that her husband was more child than king. He mocked her tenderness, ignored her pleas, and vanished for nights without word. In public, he behaved erratically, slapping courtiers, laughing during ceremonies, and speaking nonsense before foreign ambassadors. Rumors spread quickly that the king was mad, that he was possessed, that Denmark was ruled by a fool. And yet, in the cold heart of the palace, amid this chaos, something unexpected began to stir, a love affair that would alter the course of the kingdom. The man who entered Christian's life was Johann Friedrich Strunzi, a German physician hired to manage the king's unstable behavior. Strunzi was everything Christian was not: calm, rational, ambitious. His soft-spoken manner and Enlightenment ideals fascinated the lonely king. Within months, the doctor became his closest companion, soothing his fits, indulging his fantasies, and slowly gaining his trust. But as Christian's mind slipped further from reality, Strunzi's influence grew absolute. It was said that the physician could speak through the king, giving orders that bore the royal seal, but not the royal will. Denmark became a court of shadows, where power was exercised by a doctor behind a madman's throne. And in the secret rooms of Christiansborg, another intimacy unfolded between Struensee and Queen Caroline Matilda, the young queen. Starved of affection, found in the physician the warmth and intelligence her husband lacked. Their connection began in whispers and stolen glances, but soon deepened into forbidden passion. At night, as the king wandered the halls, talking to unseen figures, Caroline and Struensee met in candlelit rooms, exchanging letters written in invisible ink, their love both tender and dangerous. And perhaps the cruelest twist of all, the king himself seemed unaware or unwilling to care. He once introduced Struensee to guests as my friend, who does all my thinking for me. Under Struensee's guidance, Denmark experienced a brief, brilliant dawn. The physician implemented reforms inspired by the Enlightenment, abolishing torture, promoting education, and granting freedom of the press. For 2 years, reason ruled through madness. But no candle, however bright, can burn forever in a palace of intrigue. The nobility, humiliated by Struensee's power and scandalized by his affair with the queen, began to plot. They whispered of betrayal, of foreign influence, of sin cloaked in reform. By 1772, the court erupted in conspiracy. One freezing January night, while Christian sat trembling in his chambers, unaware of the storm outside, soldiers burst into the queen's apartments. Caroline Matilda was dragged from her bed, her letters seized, her lover arrested. Struensee was tried for treason and adultery, a farce of justice that ended with his public execution. The once gentle doctor met his end calmly, his head severed before the very people who had once cheered his reforms. The queen was exiled, sent to live out her days in lonely exile in Hanover, far from her children and the kingdom she had briefly helped to heal. As for Christian, the puppet king, he was left behind, alone, broken, and utterly lost. After Struensee's death, his madness returned in full force. He wandered the palace, muttering to himself, clinging to dolls as if they were companions, refusing to bathe or change his clothes. His courtiers tiptoed around him, addressing him with reverence but no respect. He signed papers he could not read, nodded at ministers he could not name, and lived out his days as a ghost wearing a crown. When he finally died in 1808, his son, Frederick VI, would rule in his place, wiser, stronger, and determined never to repeat his father's mistakes. Yet even now, historians look back at Christian VII with something between pity and horror. For in him, they saw not a monster like Caligula or Ivan the Terrible, but a man crushed by his own weakness, a king undone not by cruelty but by emptiness. He was a mirror reflecting the loneliness of absolute power, a reminder that behind every gilded throne may sit a trembling soul, lost between pleasure and pain, genius and insanity. When you picture him now, the pale figure in embroidered silk, staring at nothing as candles burn low around him, you can almost hear the faint echo of his laughter, high and brittle, filling the silent halls of a palace that forgot what joy was. And perhaps, in that quiet, you realize that history's most perverted kings were not always villains. Some were simply men, fragile, unloved, and consumed by the very power they thought would make them divine.